everyone, and welcome to episode 52 of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined in conversation by David, a naturalist and self-confessed nature geek who works for the National Wildlife Federation. You may have come across David before, as he is a regular in the media, including having presented a popular series on Animal Planet called Backyard Habitat, that showed people how to transform their yards and gardens into spaces where nature can thrive. Together we take a dive into how to manage our gardens in the fall and autumn. David explains why leaving the leaves is so important, from the myriad of surprising wildlife that are dependent on the leaf litter, to the benefits of reducing your environmental impact and saving yourself time and money, whilst ensuring a healthier garden. To avoid feeling overwhelmed, David also shares his pro tips on how you can keep as many leaves as possible at home, from utilising them for mulch on flower beds to composting, but also importantly reminds us to be gentle with ourselves and simply do the best we can. Gardening for wildlife is an empowering solution to the many multiple crises our environment faces, and the National Wildlife Federation have a large number of resources to help you get involved and begin your journey to create a paradise for nature at home. David's enthusiasm for nature is truly infectious, and my conversation with him filled me with both hope and inspiration, which I hope will have you looking at autumn leaves with a whole new level of wonder. If you choose to leave the leaves this year, make sure to share your pictures with David and I to celebrate choosing to be a garden hero, stewarding your patch of the earth to ensure nature, wildlife and people can thrive. Well, welcome David, and thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. We're going to share some great seasonal gardening advice for people who are wanting to encourage wildlife in their garden. But just to get us started, I always ask my guests to share a little bit about their nature story, and that can be anything of what nature's meant to you throughout your life. Any fond memories or anything you'd like to just share to get us started would be lovely.
Well, first of all, Fiona, I am thrilled to be here. I'm very excited to geek out with you about fall gardening and gardening for wildlife. And I have a little nickname for myself, and that's Nature Geek. And my
Perfect.
my nature story is really, people, they see my work for the National Wildlife Federation, and I'll be the first to admit I have the coolest job in the world. I get to be a nature geek, and you just kind of share my knowledge and my excitement as a naturalist with lots of other people and help get them inspired to want to get involved in conservation. But instead of doing it in a traditional place like a nature center or a national park, I get to do my job as a naturalist in the media. So I have hosted TV shows on Animal Planet. I have hosted TV shows on Nat Geo Wild. I am a regular on sort of the talk show circuit. And I do tons of podcasts and
Yeah.
media interviews just like this.
You
And
did
it's like,
a great series on backyard habitats, actually, didn't you? So yeah,
that's exactly
yeah.
right. That's actually how I kind of made the transition from just a traditional naturalist into somebody who's on camera. I wrote a book back in 2004 called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. And it's a how-to book on how to do what the title says. It's how to create a wildlife-friendly garden that's natural and sustainable and kind of connects into the local
Oh,
ecosystem.
amazing.
And the next thing I knew, the TV network Animal Planet turned my book into a television series, a
Oh,
makeover show.
incredible.
And I was standing in front of the camera hosting TV shows at that point. So fast forward, gosh, next year will be 20 years ago that
Oh,
the Animal
wow.
Planet series Backyard Habitat came out. So, but going back to my roots, people always ask, "Oh my gosh, you have such a cool job. How did you get into that?" And I always tell people that I was born this way. Ever
Oh, I
since I
love
can
that.
remember, even as a very small child, I just loved nature. I loved
Yeah.
animals. I loved being outside. I was very fortunate to grow up in a neighborhood where and an era really in the 80s where here in the US, parents allowed their kids to go out and play
Yeah.
and explore nature. And my sisters and I spent our, afternoons after school and all summer long running around in the woods and climbing trees and catching
Yeah.
frogs and just playing games with our friends. And that, coupled with my innate draw to the natural world, I think was just the magic combination that
Yeah.
led me to do this as a career and, kind of land my dream job at the National Wildlife Federation when I was 24 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Amazing.
next year I will actually be working at the Federation for half of my life. I
Oh,
turn 50
wow. Oh,
next year. I
congratulations.
started, yeah, so it's kind of insane to think about. But I
Yeah.
do think it is, like many people out there, I'm sure a lot of folks listening also feel that innate draw to nature.
Yeah.
And I think pretty much everybody, I think, has it. It's whether or not it was nurtured. And so even if it wasn't as a child, I'm here to nurture your inner nature geek, everyone.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
hopefully
perfect.
today you'll learn a few tips and tricks on how to create one of these natural gardens. And we're specifically going to talk about reusing your fallen leaves to do just that.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I've been quite lucky. I've got quite a diversity of guests, and there are a lot of us that have had this wonderful kind of, you know, exposure to nature as children. And some people have had that and then life has happened and they've gone off and then they've come back to it. But I've equally had people who didn't have that. They grew up in a real like urban environment and nature wasn't something that was part of their culture or their family life. And then they've come to it in later life. And I think it is this great kind of leveler that is available to all of us, no matter, whether we have a history with it or we're just creating our future with it. So it's fantastic. Just to hear your amazing story as well. I love that. I love that you've been able to make your kind of life out of it, and you just have this incredible enthusiasm, which is just infectious, which is what we need at the moment. We need people that are just so passionate that can inspire others to just fall in love with what's there on their doorstep.
I appreciate you saying that very much. And just to add one other little story to my background is that I actually, when I was in school and I majored in human and natural ecology at Emory University in Atlanta, and I really thought I was going to get involved in advocacy and
Okay.
fighting for
Yeah.
strong policy and legislation and kind of fighting against the powers that are out there
Yeah.
that are trashing our planet and killing our wildlife. And so I coupled my ecology degree with political science,
Oh,
thinking
wow.
eventually
Okay.
maybe I'd go to law school. And
Yeah.
roundabout halfway through my senior year, I was writing a thesis paper on the U.S. Endangered Species Act and why it legally didn't constitute a taking, which is a very specific thing. And I realized, oh my gosh, I hate this. This is
Yeah.
not what I'm good at.
Yeah.
It's not what brings me joy. And I ultimately had the foresight to realize that if that's the route that I really pursued, I actually wasn't going to be doing the best that I could do for the
Yeah.
cause of conservation. I
Yeah.
realized that I was not going to be effective and I wasn't going to be happy. And so,
Yeah.
of course, that was sort of like, oh gosh, I just wasted all of my parents' money going to get these degrees. So, for lack of something better to do to sort of buy myself time after I graduated to figure out what my next step was going to be, I ended up getting a seasonal position at the Chattahoochee Nature Center as a
Oh.
summer camp naturalist. And my job was to take packs of 7 and 8 year old kids in 2 week cycles
Oh,
over
wow.
the course of the summer out into the woods in the riparian habitat and fill their day with not only educational opportunities learning about nature but also making it fun and engaging and really trying to kind of get them excited. And what I learned from doing that, which I just thought was sort of a throwaway job, is that what I actually love doing and what I'm good at is getting to be a nature geek and getting to share that excitement and enthusiasm and my
Yeah.
knowledge of wildlife and nature and plants and get other people excited about it. And so here we are all
Yeah.
these years later. And like I said at the very beginning, I have the coolest job in the world. I'm so lucky. I love it. And yeah, so I know
I
not everybody has such a journey, but I'm very grateful for mine.
I think that's there's a really lovely sort of gift to people in what you've just shared, and that is that it doesn't matter maybe what you've trained in and things, but actually like it's coming back to what lights you up. And that's where you can kind of deliver your power in the world and you can help, shape the future and be this amazing force for positive change. And, it's not necessarily, you don't have to be like, a lawyer or something, like you can do it at this sort of, I mean, almost it's sort of a grassroots level, really, isn't it? Is what the National Wildlife Federation do so well. They work and encourage people at this sort of micro local level to really like have this huge positive impact. I mean, I know in the UK we have an amazing statistic that something like our gardens equate to like 10 million acres worth of habitat, and it's more than the combined area of all our national parks. And it's like it's just this incredible resource that is just sitting there, that is available, that people can actually immediately have an impact on. They don't have to wait for, the government to change some law or legislation. It's like it's there, it's in their power, they can make a change. And I think that's what's, I mean, it's exciting. I love it. It's exciting for me. I know I can see it's exciting for you too. So do you want, we're going to talk specifically about sort of seasonal at this time of year. We're fall, autumn here in the UK, we call it, but what people can do in their gardens that can help make a difference. So, do you want to talk about your campaign that you've got at the moment? Because it's Leave the Leaves Month, isn't it? Which is what you're specifically promoting at the moment.
Absolutely. But before we dive into the leaves, figuratively, I suppose, although I highly encourage anybody out there to rake leaves into a pile and jump in them. It is good for your soul. But yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to what you said about the National Wildlife Federation's work in this sort of grassroots space. So for folks not familiar, the National Wildlife Federation is one of the oldest and largest wildlife conservation and education organizations. We're based in the US, and most of our program work is really focused in the US, but folks around the world can participate and join and all of that good stuff. And yes, we do the really critically important big picture level work on policy, on regulation, fighting for strong wildlife laws, and addressing climate change and clean energy and all of those things. But at the same time, we know that there's so many different ways to engage people, and
Yeah.
one of them is at this local grassroots level with the nature that's literally right outside our door, or could be if we simply make some different choices
Yeah.
about how we manage our own piece of the earth, which is our yards and our garden spaces, right? And so back in 1973, the National Wildlife Federation pretty much kicked off this natural gardening movement
Yeah.
in the US. Now, y'all in the UK are years ahead of us. You guys have always been way into your backyard wildlife and turning your gardens into these natural habitats. So we followed your lead, and we kind of kicked this program off that today we call the Garden for Wildlife movement. And really it's about kind of addressing the habitat loss that comes from human development.
Yeah.
As we've converted the woods and the old farm fields and the rural lands into more of a suburban sprawl and replaced the native plant communities with pavement and strip malls and lawns, right?
And
Um,
non-native
and
plants as well.
and non-native
Yeah.
plants that have pretty much, sort of driven out all the wildlife.
Yeah.
And so this was a program that we designed based on wildlife biology, looking at like what the science says about what wildlife needs to survive, and then kind of translating that into a garden setting, right? So
Yeah.
how can I, as somebody who has a little patch of land, um, how can I make that into wildlife habitat? And so it was about helping the wildlife and maybe possibly helping with the decline of some, formerly common species that were pushed out by our urban and suburban sprawl and by our pollution and that kind of thing. But equally important is that it was an opportunity to give people a place to have that outdoor nature experience
Yeah.
that we are all so sorely lacking. Our
Yeah.
mission at the National Wildlife Federation is to unite all Americans to ensure that wildlife and people thrive in a rapidly changing world. And I'm going
Yeah.
to extend that to people around the world, not just Americans,
Yeah,
right? And
no,
so,
it's what we all need, isn't it? Is to
yeah.
learn to be together and next to each other, and it be mutually we're able to thrive.
Right. And so that's what Garden for Wildlife was all about. It's about helping the wildlife. It's about giving us a place to get that daily dose of nature that we are all so desperately in need of, right? And so you mentioned native plants. That's really the core of it. And it's funny because when you start talking about quote unquote garden for wildlife, a lot of times people look at you a little weird and say, wait a second, aren't the wildlife going to destroy my garden? Aren't they going to eat all my vegetables? You know, and in some cases, sure, that does happen. But here in the US, we've got, white-tailed deer everywhere, and they are just devouring plants left and right because we got rid of all their predators, right? There's no
Yeah,
more wolves
yeah,
and there's no more mountain lions in many places. But the reality is that you actually need wildlife in your garden if you want to have a productive garden. Who do you think is pollinating all of our vegetable plants, or technically fruit plants? But I'm not going to get too botanically militant here. But like our tomatoes, our eggplants, or aubergines, or courgettes, or whatever you call them around the world, right? Squashes, peppers. These are all pollinated by our wild native bees, right? And
yeah,
so you actually need, which are wildlife. The idea that insects are wildlife, I think, is something that a lot of people, it's not intuitive, right? We think of wildlife and we think of the furry animals and the feathered and
yeah,
maybe even the scaled, but we don't think about the little critters. And the garden for wildlife largely is all about those little critters, these animals that can safely coexist with us right outside our door. So the insects, the songbirds, the small mammals, even the
yeah.
medium-sized mammals, the salamanders and frogs and other amphibians, the tortoises and turtles, right? These are totally safe to live around us. We're not talking about attracting, mountain lions or bears or moose or
Only if
whatever
you're
to,
really lucky.
yeah,
Yeah.
only if you're really lucky. Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what Garden for Wildlife really is all about. And it starts with building the habitat, right? And how does Mother Nature provide habitat? It's through plants, and specifically the native plants that evolved in the region. They're co-evolved with the wildlife. They're really like two pieces of a puzzle. And so what it boils down to when you talk about quote unquote gardening for wildlife, it's really about planting the native plants and
Yeah.
replacing those non-native species that we brought in because we think they're pretty, but really have no ecological connections. They don't support any other life. And
Yeah.
so that is why a wildlife conservation group has a garden program, because it's really all about the plants. That's the core of it. And so that, kind of explains a little bit about how we
Yeah,
got on
I think
to
that's really
there.
important because I think I know in this country, so and I assume probably in the US as well, we had quite a big movement to like encourage pollinators, but part of what was lacking with that messaging was actually like providing native plants to support native pollinators and not just be, sort of superficial, like, sugar stations really in a way for bees and butterflies, but actually to provide the plants that support the entire life cycle of these insects, which is really important because the food plants for some of the, sort of caterpillar stages and things are going to be different for different species, and that's what's really important about native wildlife. And I was lucky actually, I spoke to your colleague and we did a fantastic episode specifically on your Garden for Wildlife um, organization that actually provides people with the information to find out what their native plants are and also buy them from them. So there's a lovely episode of that, and I'll link that in the show notes for people as well, so they can go and have a listen in depth to that conversation. But it is
Brilliant.
it is just such an important thing, isn't it? Like we're learning all the time. We're sort of, we're finessing these processes, realizing like we had good intentions with with our like pollinator plants. Perhaps we, didn't quite pick the best ones, but actually as we're moving forward, we're evolving and planting and forming that foundation is just the absolute cornerstone of supporting the biodiversity of of our wildlife going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's something that I think is worth pointing out, or worth me saying, and that is gardening is a journey. You're not always going to get it right the first time.
Yeah.
And I hear from so many folks who are very passionate and they want to do the right thing. And they really beat themselves up when they discover, oh my gosh, I planted the wrong thing,
Yeah.
and they take such guilt on themselves.
Yeah.
And this happens too with the leaving of the leaves for wildlife, which we'll talk about in a minute. Whatever we can do is good,
Yeah.
right? And it's okay to learn. and to change the way that you did things in the past. I have seen over the course of my, quarter decade or quarter century career as a naturalist, a real shift in people's awareness about native plants.
Yeah.
Exactly what you described. I mean, when you go back to the 70s, when National Wildlife Federation first kicked off this Garden for Wildlife movement here, we were recommending some of those really bad non-native invasive plants
Yeah.
because some of them do provide food sources in the form of berries, for example, for fruit-eating birds. And then what happens, we found out, is that the birds eat the berries, fly away, and then they poop out the seeds and spread those invasive plants.
Yeah.
And then those invasive plants essentially, there's no checks and balances on them, and they are able to essentially crowd out the diversity of native plants that all the
Yeah.
wildlife rely on, all the other wildlife. And so, we've learned, even in the conservation world, that what we told people to do 50 years ago or even 20 years ago might not be the best practice today, and that's okay. So just be gentle with yourself,
Yeah.
and your intentions to do the right thing are what's important, and just be open to learning and changing as new data become available, as new science is happening, as we discover these things. It's really a journey, and that's quite frankly one of the most exciting things to me
Yeah.
about being a gardener, and particularly about being a sort of a natural gardener, right?
Yeah.
It's all about getting more, just sort of more of a relationship with Mother Nature, really, and
Yeah.
and taking her cues on how we manage again our own piece of the earth, our yards and our gardens.
I love that, David. I think that's really a lovely sentiment to share with people because I think those of us that really care about nature, we're quite overwhelmed by, everything that's happening to nature around the world. And, we're desperately trying to like do our best. And then someone comes along and says, oh, actually, what the best that you've been doing is possibly not as helpful as you'd hoped it was. And, it can feel like your world has ended and you're like, oh,
Yeah,
I've been making the biggest mistake. And actually, it's important to remember it's a journey, and we do the best we can with what we know at the time. And then when we know better, we do better. And that's just the journey that we all have to go on. And we just have to, know we had good intentions. And, when we get more education from amazing people like yourself and the organization you work for, then we can refine our processes and improve, and nature can forgive us as well a little
there you go.
bit.
That's
So
exactly right. That's exactly right.
oh, brilliant. Well, it is, I think I love gardening. I mean, I find it is quite therapeutic, as well as helping the wildlife. It's this amazing opportunity for you to connect with nature and to be really sort of start to reconnect and feel like you are part of this amazing world that is around us. And I think that's, this time of year is one of the most beautiful times to be in nature. This was just incredible like color explosion of the fall leaves and foliage, and birds are busy and mammals are busy stashing for winter, and it's a great time to be outside. So it's it's that's a good excuse as well to to be out there and what we can
Absolutely.
do in our garden to help.
It's my favorite season. I am not a fan of the heat, and so bring on the chilly weather, bring on the sweaters and the fires and the cozy and all of that. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's a season of major change and movement in the world of wildlife and nature. As you mentioned, the vegetation is changing there from sort of reproduction and rapid growth to a season of sort of dormancy.
Yeah.
And that's true even in sort of, southern areas, or, here in the US, you're not going to get the explosion of fall leaves in Florida that you are in Maine, or
Yeah.
Southern California that you might up in Washington.
Yeah.
But there's still seasonal changes that happen, right? And so, it's a season that I think oftentimes gets forgotten when we talk about gardening for wildlife, because everybody thinks of spring and summer
Yeah.
when you think about gardening. But this is actually one of the biggest points that I want folks to think about, and that is that nature is out there doing its thing year round.
Yeah.
And there are wildlife out there that are looking for habitat resources year round. And so as you are becoming this sort of steward of the earth, as a wildlife gardener, as a natural gardener, you want to remember that. You want to be thinking about each of the seasons and whether that is, four seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter, or depending on where you live, it might be the dry season and the
Yeah.
rainy season.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. What you want to think about is what resources am I providing that are in sync with that natural rhythm of the seasons where I live? And am I providing the habitat, which really boils down to four things: natural sources of food, a water source, cover or shelter, and places where the wildlife can raise their young or the resources that they need essentially to reproduce. You want to be thinking about all four of those things and how you're providing them in each season. Now, reproduction typically does happen in the spring and the summer, right? So maybe that's not something that you can really do much for in the fall and the winter, except with the Leave the Leaves. And again, we'll talk about that. I know we're teasing it a lot and we're going to do a deep dive on it. But just as we're still talking about the general bigger principles of gardening for wildlife,
Yeah.
remember there's stuff you can be doing in all four seasons or all two seasons or whatever. And it's important. You don't want to have a gap in the year when it comes to that wildlife habitat.
Yeah, and this time of year is when you're setting yourself up for spring as well. I think that's the important thing is, nature's providing you some amazing resources at this time of year that you can, are gonna help you when you come to spring and summer next year. So it's the time for planning in the garden as well as making sure everything's got the resources it needs to get through the winter.
That's exactly right. And it's one of the reasons why last year at the National Wildlife Federation, we decided to designate the month of October as Leave the Leaves Month. And this is a message and it's a part of our Garden for Wildlife program, for as far back as I can remember. And we've been talking about the value of keeping those fallen leaves on your property, in your garden,
Yeah.
as much as you can for wildlife and for the greater ecosystem for a very long time. But it's really beginning to gain some traction. And lots of folks, I think, like we're sort of at a tipping point with people realizing how important those fallen leaves are. And so we thought, you know what, let's really amp this up and let's get
Yeah.
everybody talking about it. So
Yeah.
that's why October is Leave the Leaves month. But again, depending on where you live, your leaves might not fall until November or even December, or maybe they start falling in September. That's not important as much as take the message of Leave the Leaves month and apply it to when the leaves are falling where you are. And here is why leaving the leaves is so important. There's really three main reasons from my point of view. The first one is that fallen leaf layer that naturally occurs in nature is incredibly important habitat for wildlife. And it's important habitat now in the fall for a bunch of species. But you just touched on something that is one of the biggest reasons why it's important. It's because without the fallen leaf layer, come spring, many wildlife that otherwise could be out in your garden won't actually be able to exist. So, and some of it is surprising. So, I'd like to just sort of walk through some of the wildlife
Oh, that'd
species
be fantastic. Yeah, I'd love
that
that.
really rely on that fallen leaf layer. So, I think it's probably fairly intuitive to gardeners that invertebrates like earthworms, for
Yeah.
example, utilize and live in and under that leaf layer. They actually eat the fallen leaves as they decay, and then they turn them into, beautiful, rich soil. So, there's earthworms and many other sort of invertebrates that live in and under that natural leaf layer. One of my favorites are the pill bugs. Now, I'm not sure if you have them in the UK. I would be surprised if you didn't. They're essentially, we call them pill bugs, or some folks call them roly-poly. Some people call them potato bugs. There are these little land crustaceans. They're usually sort of a silvery gray. Some species can
Um,
roll up into a little ball.
I think we might call them like woodlouse or something like
Yes,
that.
yes,
Yeah,
woodlice,
yeah, yeah,
exactly, yes.
yeah.
And so, thank you for helping expand my naming of wildlife, my regional, global naming of wildlife. So these are incredible little creatures. Like I said, they're land crustaceans. They actually breathe through gills,
Oh
and so the
wow.
leaf layer is naturally moist. It acts like a
Yeah.
sponge, and so those little guys are running around that leaf layer too, and they're really important detoxifiers of soil as they're decomposers as they eat that fallen leaves and other things in the soil. They're able to like remove heavy metals and things like that. So
Oh,
they're pretty
incredible.
fantastic.
Yeah,
And
wow.
they're just never going to exist in a lawn.
No,
They need
no.
that leaf layer. Um, but there's a few other groups of invertebrates that I really want to focus on. The first that are very beloved here in the US are fireflies.
Oh.
And again, I don't think you have them in the UK, but
Yeah, not I
fireflies are
think not
lightning
to the
bugs.
extent that you guys do, definitely not. Whether we've got a few species maybe
Yeah.
in odd areas, but yeah, it's certainly not. You guys have cornered the market, I think.
They're really, really incredible insects, and they are essentially they're we call them lightning bugs or we call them fireflies, but they're actually neither flies nor bugs. Both flies and bugs are actual specific orders of insects. What fireflies actually are beetles, and
Oh
so they
wow.
have the typical beetle life cycle of they
Yeah.
hatch from the egg as into a grub. That's the larval phase of beetles. And so those little firefly grubs, guess where they live? In the fallen leaves.
Yeah.
So we think of the fireflies as these beautiful flying insects that are, flitting around and lighting up in the summer months and providing that just incredibly beautiful sort of neon light display. But without that fallen leaf layer, those animals don't have what they need to raise their young, even though they don't directly take care of the babies, right? That's what we mean by places to raise young, the
Yeah.
resources necessary for that phase of life. So fireflies rely on the leaf layer. Another group of insects that rely on that leaf layer are bumblebees.
Oh
And
wow, okay. Yeah.
and you definitely have bumblebees
Yeah.
in the UK. We've got a bunch of species here in North America as well. And so, the workers, the bumblebee workers basically die off in the winter months.
Yeah.
But the new queens leave the hive, and what they do is they bury themselves under that leaf layer,
Oh,
oftentimes in little burrows, and that's
yeah.
where they overwinter.
Yeah.
The other one that is really, really huge and critically important and shocking to people when they learn that this group of insects rely on the leaf layer is butterflies and moths.
Oh, okay.
So you think of
Yeah.
butterfly gardens
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, I'm going to
Yeah.
plant the nectar plants. And as you
Yeah.
alluded to a few minutes ago, as you go on your butterfly gardening journey, you learn it's not just about the nectar plants. You also have to have the host plants for the caterpillars.
Yeah.
Those are the only plants that the caterpillars can eat. But what happens to the caterpillars before they become a butterfly? They pupate. So they turn into a chrysalis, or in the case of moths, they turn into a cocoon. Most species spin a little web. And so what happens to them at this time of year? How do we go from the warm months where these insects are active and
Yeah.
then they disappear for the winter and then they emerge again in the spring?
Yeah.
Where do they go? Well, many species of particularly moths overwinter as pupa in the leaf layer.
Wow.
And in some places here in North America, 94% of our moth species are doing that. They're dropping
Wow.
off of their
Wow. That's an
caterpillar host
incredible
plants.
statistic. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the eastern US, for sure, that's the case. And they are overwintering as pupa. Some species do it as caterpillars. Some species, like the mourning cloak butterfly, for example, actually bury themselves in the leaves and the woody debris as adults, and they're able to spend the winter that way. And so, and actually, some species of caterpillars actually feed on the dead leaves. So
Oh,
there's
okay.
some butterflies like the red-banded hair streak that do that. So it's kind of
Oh,
fascinating.
wow.
Those leaves are
Yeah.
food and their insulation and their shelter, and that they're basically the nursery for the final phase of those juvenile phases before those insects can sort of become adults and complete their life cycle. So when you at this time of year get rid of all of your fallen leaves. You are literally throwing away the next generation of these
Yeah.
incredibly beautiful insects, these critically important pollinating insects, the bumblebees and the moths and things like that. And here's the thing, even if you don't care about the bugs, right? And a lot of people don't, even though they are they're the little animals out there that are keeping the world moving, right?
Yeah.
The insects
Yeah.
and other invertebrates. Think about this, and again, this is for the US, but I'm certain that there's probably a similar statistic for the UK. 96% of our upland terrestrial birds, so pretty much all of our backyard birds, not the
Yeah.
waterfowl or that kind of thing, upland terrestrial birds, 96% of them rely on a diet exclusively of insects and other invertebrates as the only thing that they could feed their babies.
Yeah.
And the biggest sort of sector of insects that they're using are caterpillars, specifically moth
Yeah.
caterpillars.
Yeah.
So if you throw away your leaves, you literally wipe out the next generation of those caterpillars that otherwise would have been present in the landscape in the spring. And what you're doing is robbing parent birds from the only foods that they can feed their babies. So if you like watching birds, and so many people do, you absolutely must create a garden space that is actually producing lots and lots of insects. And
Yeah.
it's not just a few. There was a study done again here in the US that looked at Carolina chickadees, little
Oh yeah.
chickadees,
Oh, they're
and
gorgeous.
found that one pair of chickadees, in order to successfully raise one nest of babies from hatching from the egg until they fledge from the nest, which only takes a little bit over 2 weeks, those parent chickadees needed to catch between 6 and 9 thousand insects,
Yeah.
one nest of babies, right?
Yeah.
Now multiply that by all the other birds, right?
Yeah.
And you realize that our gardens actually need to be producing literally billions of insects if we actually want to have a beautiful bird population and have our pollination and all of those other things. So, I mean, and that's just the invertebrates that we've talked about so far. There are all sorts of other wildlife that rely on that leaf layer, all of so many amphibians,
Yeah, I was gonna
salamanders and
say, like
frogs.
toads and things in this country, you always find them, a nice little leaf pile, they'll be in there.
Absolutely, yeah. Most amphibians, they like a moist environment. Again, we've talked about how the fallen leaf layer kind of helps retain some moisture. And even toads, which have sort of drier, bumpy skin, they like to be in those leaves. They're camouflaged, most toad species, right? They look like fallen leaves. There's a reason for that,
Yeah.
because that's where they want to be, right? And salamanders are just incredible animals. Here in the eastern US, for example, we actually are one of the global hotspots for amphibian diversity, specifically
Oh
salamanders.
wow. Oh
And
wow.
most people don't know that. Like the Smoky
Yeah.
Mountains, the southern Appalachian mountain range is a global hotspot for amphibian diversity. And most of those species are living in the leaves or under them. Frogs as well, terrestrial frogs anyway. So they're incredible animals. So many of our native lizards and woodland turtles, like the beloved box turtle that we have here in the US, they live in the leaves, right? So there's all these other critters. And then there's mammals, shrews, which are one of my absolute favorite animals. Um, and I know they're beloved in the UK too. I think of the Wind in the Willows and,
Yeah.
sort of all of those sort of
Yeah.
stories that, and they're definitely, they're tough little critters. They're
Yeah.
insectivores. They're feeding on all of those invertebrates living in the leaf layer, but that's their natural habitat. You want them around. And so there's a lot of them. And we actually have a bat species here in North America that also utilizes the leaf layer, which
Oh
is like,
wow.
what? Bats? Like,
Yeah,
don't bats live in caves and trees and
that's
they're flying around?
incredible.
What on
Wow.
earth do they need the fallen leaf layer for? Well, there's a species of bat called the red bat. And come winter, bats are small mammals,
Yeah.
so they need a strategy to survive the cold, freezing temperatures. Many species hibernate, so they'll enter caves, or they'll enter into tree cavities and they'll go dormant in there for the winter. Some species migrate south, kind of like birds do.
Yeah.
Some species do a little bit of both. So the northern bat, ranges up into southern, or the red bat, the eastern red bat, ranges up into Canada. And so at the northern part of its range, they will migrate south,
Yeah.
but they do it so that they can hibernate. And they want to be in a space or in a region where it doesn't get brutally cold, right? Because
Yeah.
again, they're little animals. They need to retain body heat in order to
Yeah.
survive. But what they do is they will roost up in the trees and they'll go dormant up there. But if and when the temperatures really get frigid, if it really drops below freezing, the eastern red bat will actually drop down to the ground
Wow.
and bury itself under those leaves, which
Wow.
again provide insulation. And they roll themselves up in a little ball and they're very furry and they actually can survive those sub-freezing temperatures under the leaves. Shocking, right? Who knew? I think that's one of the coolest things.
No,
When I learned
that's
about that,
incredible. I love
yeah.
that. And I mean I've seen in this country as well, like we've got hedgehogs, they will utilize the leaves to make,
Yes.
nests for themselves. We've got like badgers and things as well, and I've seen them bringing leaf litter into their burrow their sets to again, bedding for themselves, insulation, warmth for winter. So yeah, it does just go, it goes right through the whole spectrum of wildlife, basically, from the tiniest to some of the bigger animals of it is useful and needed to them for their whole life cycle.
Yes, absolutely. So that is, sort of the number one reason for the National Wildlife Federation why we're so into the fallen leaves because they're wildlife habitat. It makes
Yeah.
sense. But there's really two other big reasons why we encourage people to keep their leaves on their property. The second one after wildlife is probably, quite honestly, an even bigger one. And it's also kind of shocking when people learn about this. And that is that keeping your fallen leaves can have an impact on global climate change.
Oh, wow.
Here's why. And again, I'm not sure how much this applies to the UK because I'm not as familiar with sort of your municipal waste streams.
Yeah.
But here in the US, people throw away their trash, and that often includes yard waste,
Yeah.
and much of it goes into landfills where it's
Okay.
buried
Yeah.
underground, right? And so there's some shocking statistics. So, and these are coming from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So they looked at this. They have some data out from 2018, and in 2018. They recorded over 35 million tons. I think it was 35.5
Wow.
million tons of yard waste
Wow.
went into the municipal waste stream.
Wow.
35 million tons in
Wow.
1 year, right? And so that is, it's grass clippings, it's woody debris and brush, but a
Yeah.
big portion of it
Yeah.
is fall leaves, right?
Yeah.
And a whopping 10.5 million tons ended up getting buried in our landfills. So
Wow.
what happens then, right? So it's underground and there's really no oxygen under there. And when that organic material is breaking down in that oxygenless or anaerobic condition, it produces methane.
Okay.
And so our landfills are spewing this methane. Now, methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases that when it goes up into the atmosphere, it traps heat. So,
Yeah.
carbon dioxide
Yeah.
is probably the biggest one, right? And
Yeah.
we're burning fossil fuels and releasing that. And that's, the most significant driver of global climate change. But methane is up there. And it's something like 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat.
Wow.
So when you bag up your leaves and you throw them away and they go to the landfill, they actually are contributing to global climate change. And in the US, the landfills are actually the third largest source of methane.
Huh.
So it's not like an
Yeah.
insignificant thing,
Yeah.
right?
Wow.
So
Yeah.
this so I guess, what I want folks to think about is keeping your leaves on your property isn't going to end climate change, right? We obviously need to address that at the big picture level, but it is absolutely something that we can all do. It's a personal action that we can take that can and will make a difference. And it might be small on the individual level, but all of this stuff, the entire concept of Garden for Wildlife, and particularly the Leave the Leaves concept, is all about thinking globally, but acting locally.
Yeah.
And when I do it, and you do it and our neighbors do it, it does actually add up. And that's true whether it's reducing your lawn and planting more native plants, or not using pesticides, or keeping your leaves out of the landfill. So there is that climate change connection. So it's about the wildlife habitat. It's about these small personal actions that we can take, to minimize our own contributions to global climate change. And then the third reason why we encourage people to leave the leaves is probably the simplest, and that is they're a free resource.
Yeah.
So think about this. At this time of year, in the fall, in the northern hemisphere, in temperate areas anyway, the deciduous trees and shrubs, the herbaceous perennials, and quite honestly, even the evergreens with needles drop their foliage.
Yeah.
The evergreens don't drop at all, but I've got a big old white pine right outside my window here. And let me tell you, those suckers drop a lot of needles at this time of year. But what happens to those leaves and needles when they fall off? They fall down to the base of the plant where they cover the soil, where they absorb moisture and retain that moisture in the soil. They suppress weeds and they slowly compost and break down and return nutrients right to the root zone of the plants. That to me sounds an awful lot like mulch and fertilizer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right? Yet we have been trained by sort of the industrial gardening complex And I say that kind of facetiously, but it is. It's a big industry, right?
Yeah.
That makes lots and lots of money. And they have told us, oh, well, you have to rake away all your leaves, right? You have to have a pristine looking lawn. You can't have any of that stuff. It's messy, it's ugly, it's dirty, and throw it away. Oh, and by the way, let me sell you back bagged mulch and chemical fertilizers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's insane. Mother Nature gives us this
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
right?
and you add the plastics to that. It's like you bag your leaves into plastic, and then you
Right.
like, and you throw it in your landfill, and then you go to your local
Right.
garden
Right.
centre and buy more plastic wrapped compost and mulch, and yeah,
Exactly, right? And so it's like sometimes this stuff is just like it's like that light bulb of like, oh wow, like it really is simple. Like
yeah,
I don't have to do all this stuff. I don't have to spend all of this money. I don't have to have all this negative ecological impact. In fact, I can do just the opposite. I can keep it simple. I can reuse, recycle what Mother Nature is giving me, right? And so leaving the leaves on your property, or at least as many as you can, is really important because it supports wildlife, it minimizes our personal contribution to climate change, and it makes gardening easier and cheaper for us. Like it's a win-win all around. Um,
yeah.
so
I think that's the fantastic thing is it's realizing like these actions have, multiple ripples out, and like whatever your sort of reason for doing it, like whether it's you want to help the wildlife, or you want to sort of reduce your impact on the climate, global warming and things. It's like you actually do all of those just by doing this one action, and that's what's so incredible about it, is when we start looking at these smaller actions that we can make closer to home, like the impact we can have is huge. You mentioned that in this country, I think we do have like specific waste collections. We have a specific like rubbish bin that is for like composting, and they go more to like a composting facility. So in some respects, possibly a little bit better in terms of like it's not necessarily going into landfill, but obviously we're still losing the wildlife benefits in your garden. And
right,
you're also still, someone is still, driving a truck around, coming, picking up your rubbish, taking it back. Then, they are creating compost, but then that's got to be brought
right.
back. So it's, a lot of it still applies to this country as well.
Right. And that's a brilliant example of what we talked about a little bit earlier about being kind to yourself. And I hear from so many people when they learn all about leaving the leaves and why they're important, who are just so, distraught when their leaves are going to the compost facility instead of, being kept on the property. And I just, again, like, I want folks to know, like, take a deep breath with me, right? It's all okay. Anything you can do that's different than dumping them in the landfill or burning them, right? Which releases carbon dioxide right immediately into the air and destroys the wildlife habitat. If you can't keep every last leaf on your property, it's not an ecological sin, right? Like no one's gonna come judge you and shame you, right? So it's okay. Like be kind to yourself. And you're absolutely right. I'm glad you brought that up. Here in the US, some communities do have the municipal level composting. And that is
Yeah.
absolutely a viable thing to do with your fallen leaves, especially if you have so many leaves on your property that you can't keep them all on your property. And this is where, maybe we could finish up here with I have some pro tips on
Yeah, that'd
how
be
to leave
brilliant.
your leaves the right way, right?
Yeah.
And so, here in the US, we love our lawns. People are obsessed, and there's this whole sort of pristine monoculture, pure aesthetic, which is just there's so much wrong with it. So
Well,
many
you
different
you have a
levels.
lot of communities where you have homeowners associations as well, don't you?
Correct.
I think
Yeah,
I think we have a little bit of it here, not anywhere near to the degree that you do, but in those sort of situations, people are kind of dictated like
correct.
what
Yeah,
they can and can't do. Their place has to look neat and tidy and controlled at all
exactly.
times.
Yes. And that controlled is really the great word for it because really that whole aesthetic, that whole kind of setup, that whole kind of structure of governance is really designed to essentially very like command and control of nature, right? It's
Yeah.
all about This has to be exactly the opposite of nature. Again, a monoculture instead of diverse. No life. It's all pesticides. It's all chemical fertilizers, right?
Yeah.
One single leaf on the lawn can get you a fine, right? It drives me bonkers, to be frank.
Yeah.
But thank God I don't live in a place with a homeowners association, but many people do, to your point. And in fact, we did a survey this year for Leave the Leaves Month here in the US and found that 52% of people who responded are dictated by either a
Oh, wow.
homeowners association or just sort of municipal
Yeah,
weed
wow.
and landscape maintenance regulations to remove the leaves. And that means remove them from the lawn. And this is my first pro tip.
Right.
If you have leaves and that you have to move off of your lawn, and yes, if you get a thick layer of leaves on your lawn, it's going to smother your lawn. To which I say, great. The less lawn we have, the better. Lawn is really that dead zone, right?
Yeah.
But well, everybody has lawn, right? I have some lawn.
It's
I'm
a
not
journey. We
putting,
remember it's a
right.
journey at the you
Exactly.
might not be ready
Yes.
to let go of your lawn just yet.
Totally. And again, this is the other area where again, I think we need to practice kindness. Like I have some lawn myself, right? I don't put pesticides on it. I don't fertilize it. I don't water it. I minimized it. When I bought my house back in 2020, it was nothing but lawn. And I've reduced that lawn by almost 50% just by adding garden beds and
Oh,
planting
wow.
native plants in them, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the pro tip is that what you want to do is keep the leaves on your property and use them as mulch in your garden beds,
Yeah.
just like you would use it in any other kind of mulch, right? So you want to have a layer that's not too thin, not too thick. I usually recommend anywhere from 3 to 5 inches of sort of fresh leaves. And
Okay.
that's maybe a little bit thicker than you would store-bought mulch, but that's because those leaves pretty quickly, the first time it rains,
And
they're going to start
compact
sinking
down.
down and
Yeah.
get packed down and that kind of thing. So, put them in your garden beds just like any other mulch. Don't let them pile up too deep, otherwise they will smother even your perennial plants. Don't
Yeah.
pile the leaves up against the bark of woody plants like trees. That can cause rot. But just use them like any other kind of mulch. And, if you're worried about aesthetics, because it is a little bit of a rougher look than a lot of store-bought mulches, just, you can be intentional about creating a nice clean edge around
Yeah.
that garden
Yeah.
bed, right?
Yeah.
And that communicates to people that this is intentional, that it's not
Yeah.
just me being lazy,
Yeah.
right? So things like that. And, that's going to vary again, depending as far as the depth of the leaves, depending on the kind of leaves. If you have a lot of oaks, for example, their leaves are pretty tough and they will persist. Maple leaves, they melt away pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
maybe you want to put
Yeah.
a little bit more if you have nothing but maple leaves or something like that, one of
Yeah.
those softer
Yeah.
type leaves. But the goal is to put enough that it's not going to smother your plants, but it will provide that moisture retention and weed suppression and composting benefit to your plants in your garden beds, and that it's going to last until the spring at least.
Yeah.
And for me, where I am, I live in New Jersey, right outside of New York City. It's about a 3 to 5 inch layer, gets me through until the spring when all my plants leaf out and basically cover the
Yeah.
soil.
Yeah.
So that's the main pro tip is like, you don't have to just leave them where they lie, although that is the most natural thing.
Yeah.
You can move them, hopefully with a rake and not a leaf blower,
Yeah.
which are horribly polluting and loud and obnoxious, and I can't stand them. Get a little bit of exercise, rake those leaves,
Yeah.
be old school. It's
Old school
cool.
gardening for the win, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the only other pro tips to share are the wind. So I mentioned when the leaves get wet, they're going to sink down a little bit. And so that's one of the number one sort of fears that people have is, oh, I'm going to move them all. And then the first time the wind blows, they're going to blow back on my lawn. And yeah, that will happen to a degree, but just get the hose out and wet them down
Yeah,
after you've
okay.
moved them into the garden bed. And
That's
that
a really good
solves
idea. Yeah.
90% of that.
Yeah.
And it also helps them become the natural leaf layer where all the
Yeah.
wildlife live because the leaf layer needs that moisture. Um, we talked very briefly at the very beginning about sort of regional differences.
Yeah.
And so that comes into play again with the kind of leaves or needles. In the American South, a lot of people have a lot of pines, and so they
Yeah.
use pine straw, is what we call it. And
Okay.
so use your pine straw. That's totally fine. Mix it with deciduous leaves. That's fine. Um, However, if you live somewhere where wildfire is an issue,
Okay.
you definitely want to follow the local best practices for fire safe landscapes. So
Okay.
here in the American West, for example, which is naturally a lot more arid than the East is, and again with climate change, we're seeing incredible increases in the amount of wildfires happening and the intensity of them. It's a real huge problem. People are losing their lives, they're losing
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
property, et cetera. And so it's an important message is that, we don't want you to, leave the leaves because it's good for wildlife and put yourself at risk, right?
Yeah.
So just
Yeah.
follow the best practices for fire safe landscaping. And what that means essentially is that you can still have natural landscaping, but maybe not right against your house, right? Create
Okay.
that fire free zone. And in fact, the National Wildlife Federation, we've just put out a tip sheet about fire safe landscaping that will give you some more pro tips about that specifically. But otherwise, have at it. Keep those leaves, keep as many of them on your property. And if you have too many leaves to use in your garden beds, absolutely, it's totally fine to send them to the municipal composting or even to just compost them at home. Add them to your existing compost pile. They count as brown material, or literally just pile the leaves in one big mountain in the back part of your yard, and they will naturally break down and compost with just the leaves themselves. And come spring, that stuff is called leaf mold,
Yeah.
and it is really, really great sort of natural fertilizer in your garden bed. So, there's so many different ways that you could do this. Whatever you can do is a good thing. Don't beat yourself up if you can't keep every last single leaf.
Yeah.
Um, if you have too many leaves, I also actually would recommend getting in like touch with your neighbors, with your local gardening group, with your local birding or butterfly club, and offer them out. I am one of those weirdos that I don't have enough leaves on my own yard to fill my own garden bed. So I take a tarp up and down my street and I rake all of my neighbors' leaves that have put them out on the curb for the, collection,
Yeah,
and I drag them back.
I was thinking that. I was thinking, oh, I wonder if there's like, we have allotments, which is where like people have sort of communal like vegetable areas and stuff where people might be, wanting extra leaves to go into their own compost bins and stuff. So again, it comes back to this idea of community as well, isn't it? It's like, like in the same way that, all the wildlife kind of works together, it's like, actually we can kind of bring that into our own communities and how we're managing our gardens and realize that, perhaps we don't have to manage our garden in isolation and maybe our neighbor might want some leaves or we might want some of our neighbor's leaves. And
That's
it's,
exactly right. I love that. It really is about community. And, also plant sharing, right? One of the best ways to get the great locally native plants is to hook up with friends and neighbors who are growing them. And so I do encourage people to get involved in those local native plant groups. And again, the birding clubs and the butterfly
yeah,
folks and the pollinator fans. And, nowadays with social media, there are tons of online groups on Facebook and Reddit and places where you can connect with other folks who are interested in this, and you can get the leaves if you need them. You can maybe find a home for the leaves if you have too many. You can get the great native plants and pro tips from your friends and from this community of people who are doing this. It really is. I love that idea that it's the gardening for wildlife is about restoring the natural community and the relationships between the plants and the animals. And that's really what the definition of ecology is. But it's equally about restoring the human community, right?
yeah, yeah.
And I love that. As I said earlier, the Garden for Wildlife movement at the National Wildlife Federation, it's about helping wildlife, but it's also about helping people connect to nature. And that community aspect is something I never really thought about. So thank you
No,
for saying that, because now I'm gonna internalize that. And I'm gonna share that in my next interview because it's
yeah.
really important.
I think is, it's like we all have like in the UK perhaps quite a lot of people, especially a lot of the newer built properties have quite small gardens and things. So it's like if you can, create a bit of community, it's like, you can complementary plant amongst like, and create a bigger scale of habitat although you're all doing your own little piece of it, like a mosaic. And I think, yeah, it's just exciting. There's so many ways that you can go with this. And I mean, one of the things that I've spoken to people before about is like when you start gardening with nature rather than, like, trying to enforce your will on it, is like a lot of the native plants quite like to migrate in your garden as well. They like to go,
Yes.
you go, oh, I think you'll be good there, and they go, no, I think I'll be better over here. And I think, that's a bit with leaves as well. If obviously if you're not in a wildfire risk area, and you can have a little bit of time, see where the wind sort of blows the leaves to settle, and then think, oh, that might be a good place to actually make a nice pile or a compost heap or something.
Yes.
And yeah, just, play with it and enjoy it, and see what happens. And maybe if you've got a bigger garden, get some trail cameras, and you might catch
Oh
some
my
of the
gosh.
critters using it.
Yes.
And
I
yeah,
totally do that, by the way.
yeah.
I've got little, I don't even use like trail cameras. I've got these little sort of security cameras that you
Oh
can buy
yeah, yeah.
nowadays. And they're all, they're all Wi-Fi based and they're all linked. So I like put those all around my property and I get to see who's walking around. And, I've seen the local fox who comes in and out of my yard on the regular basis that I very, very rarely see with my own two eyes. I've seen warblers that I never would see because they're typically up in the top of the trees that happen to come down to the ground for like 2 seconds, and
Yeah,
I would never have known that they were in my yard. So absolutely, I love that idea. And but yeah, the whole idea of gardening with wildlife is you can really just take some of the pressure off.
yeah,
And we we have so many other things in life that give us pressure that we have to worry about. And so I feel like being a little bit more natural in your approach to your yard or your garden. And it's just it's like almost like an act of self-care and kindness, right? Like
yeah,
just go with the flow. Take that
yeah,
deep breath, like I said earlier, and just sort of get in Mother Nature's rhythm. And
yeah,
it's good for you too, It's good for our emotional
yeah,
well-being to get out in the garden and enjoy it and be natural. So that's what we really hope people are going to embrace with Garden for Wildlife and this Leave the Leaves campaign. That's why we do this stuff at the National Wildlife Federation, because we know it works and there's data behind it. We know that when you do these things, wildlife will increase. We know that people will have more wildlife watching opportunities when you do this. And we know that when we all do it, the collective benefit really does add up. Even though it's a small personal action, when lots of us do it, we do create those green corridors through
yeah,
our cities and our towns and our neighborhood. But it really starts with you. It
yeah,
starts with how you choose to maintain your own piece of the earth.
yeah.
It starts with, your choices, and the benefit then just expands to the community, both the natural community and the human community. So it's such a win-win.
Yeah, and I think you've also got a wonderful opportunity. People can certify their gardens, can't they, with you, to show they've kind of pledged like their
Yes.
allegiance, as it were, to wildlife, and creating a better future for biodiversity and things. And I think that's lovely as well, because it kind of particularly perhaps if you're in a homeowners association or something, it gives you a little bit of credibility, a bit of support as well, that you know
Absolutely.
you're breaking the mold, but you're doing it, backed by science and a big
Exactly. Yeah.
organization. And yeah,
Yeah, that element of recognition that we call certified wildlife habitat designation for your yard or other garden space that you might have is has always been a part of this Garden for Wildlife movement at the National Wildlife Federation, and that's because we want to recognize people for
yeah,
doing the right thing,
yeah,
and it does create a sense of community, and that's really how I think of it. When you choose to submit your garden or your landscape and have it certified by the National Wildlife Federation, it's really about joining the community and being a voice in
yeah.
your community for this stuff. And look, the wildlife can't read the sign, the yard sign, right? It's not like they don't care, right? The most important thing is that you create the habitat. But when you opt to go that extra step and join the community by certifying, well, number one, not only do you help support the mission of the National Wildlife Federation, because there's a fee involved and that money goes right back in to help support our program work. So,
Yeah,
helps, it's what allows me to come out and do this kind of thing. But when you post that yard sign that said this landscape, this garden is providing food, water, cover, and places to raise young for the local wildlife, it does add a sense of legitimacy, which can be practical, right? It
Yeah.
could be the thing that you need to get your neighbor or your HOA from harassing you if
Yeah.
you have a more natural aesthetic to
Yeah.
your garden. But it also spreads the word, and there is
Yeah.
no better grassroots way of really getting the word out than when folks participate and they
Yeah.
put these yard signs out. I see
Yeah.
them as I travel around the country here in the US. And it's like I get the biggest charge out of it every single time I spot one of our signs because
Yeah.
it's so cool. And I know that people, neighbors are asking that person who went through that process and certified the property and put the yard sign out, what is that? Oh, and it's a learning opportunity. It's a
Yeah.
conversation starter.
Yeah.
And in marketing, there's that sort of rule that people need to see or hear something seven
Yeah.
times
Yeah.
before it sinks in and before they
Yeah.
start to notice it. So everybody that's out on their morning walk, their morning jog, or walking their dog, or even just driving by is seeing that message.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
hey, if it works for wasteful products that we don't need, let's utilize the same
Yeah,
tactic for good
exactly.
stuff, right? And so
That's it.
that's
That's
what the
it.
yard signs are all about. And we actually, and even though again, National Wildlife Federation is based in the U.S. and much of our program work is focused here, programs like Garden for Wildlife and the Certified Wildlife Habitat designation are open to people everywhere. And we'd love to get more folks in the UK participating.
Yeah.
Again, mostly because you all really are the leaders in natural gardening. You all started
I know
it,
I
and
know your garden for wildlife with the native plants. I know when I had the conversation with Shubha about that, he was like quite keen that he wants to roll this out around the world. So I know you guys
yeah.
have got ideas and plans to support people elsewhere as well. But oh, it's been fantastic talking to you, David. I'll make sure for everyone who's listening that we'll have lots of links in the podcast description so they can learn more about you. They can learn more about the National Wildlife Federation. They can look up your tips for the pro tips for leaves and
Yep.
also and you've got amazing resources available to people who are wherever they are on their journey, whether this is brand new to them or whether they're a little way along their garden for wildlife journey. There's amazing resources on the websites that they can make use of. Is your book still available if people
It
yeah
sure is, yeah. It's
so
called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. It is also a National Wildlife Federation book. So every time you purchase it, you're doing double good because not only is it going to teach you how to create one of these wildlife gardens, but a portion of the proceeds go right back into the National
oh
Wildlife
fantastic.
Federation's program. So, and it's
Perfect.
a how-to book, I should mention. So I've got plant lists and beautiful, photos to inspire you and diagrams and all of that stuff. And it literally will walk you through step by step on how to create a basic wildlife habitat garden.
Oh, amazing. Oh, I love that. Well, David, is there anything that you would just like to leave people with today as we wrap up? Any words of wisdom? I mean, you've shared loads already, but if there's a little message that you'd like to leave anyone with today would be fantastic.
I think it's just the simple message that it's our choice on how we want to steward this planet. It's our choice on the planet that we want to leave to our kids and our grandkids.
Yeah,
And those choices can be big, but they can also be simple and small. And they can also be something that we choose to do literally right outside our own door.
yeah,
That's important and it makes a difference. And it's really at the end of the day about supporting life. It's about supporting
yeah.
life and communities, both wildlife and people. So that's what Garden for Wildlife is all about. And I guess I'll finish by saying I hope folks listening were inspired and that you will click on some of the links that Fiona's going to put down below here and you will learn a little bit more. And again, don't be intimidated. Start where you are, learn as you go, and we're here to help you.
Yeah, and also if you're leaving your leaves, tag us in your pictures as well. So, display them proudly and we'd love to see them on social media. There's links there as well. So you can tag us and share. That'd be fantastic. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, David. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Your enthusiasm is just infectious, and I hope my listeners have, grabbed hold of some of that today, and it's just brightened up their day listening to you because it's really brightened my day speaking to you. And I find it exciting. I love that the fact that there's people like you in the world, and it is possible. We can make a difference, and it doesn't have to be complicated. Conservation doesn't have to be out there in Africa or these exotic places. It can be right here at home in our back garden, and that's something that we can all take part in and be a part of making a change for a positive future for us all. So thank you so much, David, for your time, and hopefully I'll speak to you again. I'd love to have a chat. Maybe we could do another seasonal one, maybe come out the other side of winter once we've done hibernating and and talk about what we can do in our gardens then as well.
Well, it was my pleasure, and sign me up. I will come on anytime you want to geek out with me about nature and wildlife and all this good stuff.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I truly hope this conversation has brought some hope and inspiration into your life. I would love to have these messages ripple out across the world. So if you can, please share this episode with your friends, leave a review on your favourite podcast player, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I would love to hear from you, so please feel free to connect with me on the links provided in the podcast description. But most importantly, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. But don't forget to simply get out there and enjoy the natural world.